I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our session on Russia and Ukraine with Dmitry K. Symes, the president and CEO of the Center for the National Interest. The war that began on February 24th has taken an unexpected turn, at least initially. Russia was hoping to deliver a knockout blow to Kiev. Instead, the United States is now embroiled in what amounts to a long-term proxy conflict with Russia over Ukraine. President Putin appears, at least for now, to be bogged down in Ukraine. Dmitry will address the situation between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine based on his recent 2-week visit to Moscow. And the first question that I'm going to ask him is, why are the liberal hawks and the neoconservatives, who are now ascendant in debates in Washington, wrong when they essentially push for what amounts to unconditional surrender or regime change in Moscow? What's wrong with the thesis that the United States now has the upper hand, Putin has badly blundered, and the United States can actually claim victory, not just in Ukraine, but over its longtime adversary, Vladimir Putin? Dmitry, please take it away.
Jacob, the United States, of course, can claim victory, but there is a difference between claiming victory and being victorious. And if you claim victory and act like you have achieved victory and demand nothing short of unconditional surrender before a situation at the battlefield justifies this approach, you may burn your fingers, and not just fingers, very badly. You also may find yourself in a situation when there would be real escalation, and escalation would go out of control. I was watching a couple of days ago with a sense of amazement and concern, a very distinguished former US commander who was on CNN and who was explaining how to handle Putin's nuclear weapons. And his response was, don't allow Putin to blackmail the United States with his tactical nukes. Well, if the West comes to the West, let him use a couple of them. It would not change anything fundamentally in terms of the balance of power, and we will continue and we will prevail. I found this, to put it delicately, rather disturbing, because we do not know what is going to happen if a couple of tactical nuclear weapons are used, against which targets they would be used, with what level of casualty, collateral damage, and what would be a tremendous pressure on the United States to reply in kind or even with real percentage points. And we do not know what happens with the use of nuclear weapons if you do it against another power which also has comparable nuclear force. We just do not know. And I think that to enter that territory, to put it mildly, would be a very delicate experiment, especially in a situation when you're talking about Ukraine, which is not a NATO member, when you do not have appropriate treaty obligations, and when very important American interests are at stake, but not fundamental, certainly not as fundamental as survival of the American civilization. But let's assume even that Putin would not use nuclear weapons. Still, do you want to have a nuclear power, still a major nuclear power, determined to do you damage wherever it can? That would be a rather dangerous situation, defeating Russia is not the end of international competition for power and influence. There are a lot of countries, there are a lot of movements which are hostile to the United States. And to create a situation when Russia essentially would feel humiliated, when Russia would feel like Germany felt after Versailles, that it needs revenge, when Russia would be united against the American enemy, I think that we will not have to wait very long before there would be severe consequences for the United States. People today are celebrating our yet to take place victory in Ukraine. They already forgot about our very real defeat in Afghanistan. And if you would imagine that in every situation like Afghanistan, Russia would act as our mortal enemy, I don't think that this is a global environment we want to face as long as we have a choice. And last but not least, I think that everybody understands that the most fundamental challenge to the United States is coming from China, not from Russia. And if you push Russia, reliably push Russia as a junior partner toward China, and allow China to assume that in any confrontation with the United States, they can rely on Russia, I think that you would be creating a global backlash against the United States. You would be doing a very major mistake, or essentially creating a counter coalition against yourself. And I'm pretty certain that if China and Russia would really enter that path, there would be other countries and movements that would want to join them. It would not be a comfortable global environment for the United States.
Dmitry, given the hostility that exists between the United States and Russia, not to mention Europe and Russia, there aren't that many people who are traveling to Moscow these days. You were just there. What was the thing that struck you as the most surprising or important thing that you occurred during your recent visit to Moscow?
Jacob, two things. First, the extent to which even very senior people in the Russian government were claiming that they were not quite aware of Putin's plan to attack Ukraine, especially to have a full-scale attack on Ukraine with very, I would say, broad and ambitious objectives. I talked to at least two people who acknowledged that they knew that such attack was likely to take place. But they also were arguing that they learned about that just several days before the attack. And one reason they have learned so late, because Putin did not plan this attack well in advance. He was trying to use military maneuvers around Ukraine, very loud and polemical statements in order to put pressure on the United States. But when his bluff was called, he found himself in a situation when he either had to retreat and to essentially suffer a serious political defeat, or to do what he had done. And that was not entirely a surprise to some of his advisors, but that he would go as far as he did with fairly limited forces, it certainly looked like a surprise. I talked to several people who were regular guests on Russian federal channels and who now refuse to appear. And they refused to appear entirely on their own because, as they said to me, they are not certain what they can say since they were so fundamentally wrong, because they did not expect that Putin would do what he has done, and they felt embarrassed, but they also felt, frankly, shaken in their certainty that they really understood what was going on. And these were some of the most serious, at least in my mind, Russian foreign policy experts. But the second thing that made a major impression on me, if you wish, conclusions people were drawing. And I had lunch with three fairly senior officials, one of whom was really very, very senior. And one person at this table said to me, you know, if on February 23rd, we were told that something like that was going to happen, we would do everything in our power to dissuade the president. We would whatever we have, even take our children, just don't do it. But then the person said, then there was February 24th. And on February 24th, our country was in war. You can call it whatever, but of course, we knew that we were at war, and we knew that we were at war not so much with Ukraine, but with the collective West headed by the United States. And in that war, we are all together. We fully support our commander-in-chief. We are not interested in trying to figure out who said what to whom and what options we could have under different circumstances. But the bottom line is, we are not going to be defeated. Defeat is not an option. And we do think that whatever we have done wrong, whatever mistakes we have committed, they certainly do not justify the way Russia is treated and was treated by the collective West during all these years. It was an element of fatalistic determination, which I found impressive, surprising, and something that really has to be taken into account in developing our policy toward Russia today.
Dmitry, we're getting a number of questions already, and I'd like to encourage any viewers to submit questions. I will try to pose as many of them as possible. Our first one is from Jim Hoagland of the Washington Post, and he asks, Dmitry, did you obtain from your Moscow discussions a sense of why Putin chose to invade Ukraine now?
Well, Jim, I tried to, in a way, address that. I think that there was a growing sense in Moscow that Ukraine was more and more integrated in the Western camp, that Ukraine was getting more and more Western assistance, including increasingly military assistance, and that basically Russian consents, and if you wish, Russian demands were being ignored. I think that he played it wrong, because he presented demands last December, which clearly were unrealistic, and diplomatically it was a bridge too far. And the United States, of course, could not accept to make a commitment not to arm Ukraine, not to have any military maneuvers jointly with Ukraine, and essentially to say never ever for Ukraine NATO membership. I do not know how these demands were formulated and who participated in those decisions. I have more respect for seasoned professionals at the foreign ministry, starting with Sergei Lavrov himself, to think that perhaps they did not play a decisive role in formulating these demands, but I really do not know it for sure. What I do know, I think by now with certainty, that there was an expectation in Moscow, a false expectation in Moscow that we know now, that the US response, NATO response would be, we cannot do everything you're asking, but yes, we will start serious discussions with you about European security and specifically about NATO membership for Ukraine and the security guarantees for Russia. Instead, the answer was more or less, how dare you to demand something like that We have open door policy in NATO, and it is not for you, Moscow, to announce how we would invite our new members. It was this wholesale rejection of Russian position and simultaneously new sanctions and simultaneously new announcement of new arms supplies to Ukraine, initially fairly modest, but clearly it was going exactly contrary to what Moscow was asking, that I think persuaded Putin to do what he did. I think that if Russia was told at that time that, look, you are asking too much, but let's start negotiations. We can feel your pain, and let's agree that Ukraine is not going to become a NATO member anytime soon. And you should understand that. We know you understand that. So let's try to find a diplomatic formula which would be short of a new treaty banning NATO membership, but which would provide you satisfactory assurances that Ukraine would not be turned into, if you wish, an attack zone against Russia. I think that if that was done, Russia probably would be complaining, Russia probably would not be satisfied, we would get a lot of lectures of how we're not taking seriously Russian legitimate interests. But I think that Putin probably would not attack. Again, I do not know that, but that's my assumption.
We have a follow-up from Jim Hoagland, which I'll just pose to you quickly. He says, is there any significance to Lavrov's non-appearance yesterday?
I don't know. As you can see, I'm here in Washington. I do not know about yesterday. When I was in Moscow, Lavrov kind of seemed to be in his normal shape, and he was not quite a member of the inner circle, but he certainly did not look out of favor. I had a long lunch with him, and he did not look unduly concerned. But after that, he obviously had this infamous interview with an Italian paper where he talked about Jewish issues, and let's say, not very skillfully. But there is little doubt in my mind that contrary to perceptions in the West, Lavrov basically is a voice for moderation and restraint. I am not suggesting that he is not loyal to his commander-in-chief. I am not saying that he is not prepared what he is required to do, but I think that clearly Lavrov represents diplomacy. And I have seen on Russian TV, when I was still in Russia, indirect but clear attacks on Lavrov and on the foreign ministry in general for being too focused on the West, not sufficiently eager to turn Russian policy to the East. And nobody said that Lavrov and the foreign ministry were not sufficiently patriotic. But since these attacks were coming from prominent parliament members from the ruling party, it was clear that at least some important politicians are unhappy with the foreign ministry and Lavrov personally.
We have a question from Judith Miller, who wants to pose the famous Petraeus question. How does this end?
Well, I think that a lot depends upon the United States. I fully agree that today the Russian favorite term, the balance of forces, is clearly not working in the Russian favor. I also think that confronted with an unprecedented coalition of 40 countries supporting Ukraine and providing Ukraine not only with economic, but increasingly meaningful and far-reaching military assistance, I think that Russia finds itself very much on the defensive. But then, there is always a question where you stop. Russia has suffered in the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, a humiliating defeat in Crimea. And Russia lost a lot of rights, including the right to have navy in the Black Sea, but nobody demanded a fundamental change in the regime. And with an exception of small pieces of Russian territory surrendered to Turkey in the Caucasus, there was no territorial change, and Crimea remained Russian. Of course, Nicholas I died on his own, so I shouldn't say there was regime change, but there was an important personal change and then a change of policy. In 1905, Russia has suffered a humiliating defeat from Japan, and it had to surrender some territory, particularly Manchuria and part of Sakhalin. But again, nobody demanded that the emperor would resign, and Russia was assured that if it would accept peace, it would be welcomed back in the family of nations, in the United States, and even Great Britain, which was supporting Japan, that they would be prepared to have, again, normal relations with Russia. If you tell Russia today that they have to accept the defeat, which would require them to surrender every piece of Ukrainian territory which they consider theirs, including Crimea, and if they would be also told that simultaneously reserves of the central bank, which were currently frozen by the West, that these reserves would be taken away and would be given to Ukraine to pay for reconstruction, I cannot imagine that it would be an outcome acceptable to Russia, and then it would have to be resolved by combat. And then I do not know what kind of weapons and at what point Russia would want to use. And let me make one very clear point here. We can say as many times as we want that this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, not between Russia and the United States, Russia and Western Europe. Very few people in Russia, very few people who have power in Russia accept that. They do believe that they are confronted with a military coalition organized by the collective West. But at this point, they're acting with a certain restraint. They did not announce mobilization. They call it a special operation rather than war. And this is not just a question of language. They do not want to tell their population. They want to press their population a kind of to suffer those kind of challenges and hardships which are associated in Russia with major war. But if you press Russia into the corner, I think President Biden understands that. They can make decisions which we do not like and which we do not expect. We did not expect that Putin would do what he did in the case of invading Ukraine, proceeding with a major invasion of Ukraine. I don't think we want to experiment what Putin would do if we press him into the corner.
A related question on this issue from Kenneth Kaplan, who asks, you talk about Russian officials' determination to achieve victory, whatever may have been their initial mistakes or reservations. But how durable is that determination in light of Ukraine's performance and the flow of Western arms?
If I created an impression that I think that Russia is demanding victory, I regret that I did not mean it at all. I think Russia is determined to avoid the defeat. A real victory, especially if we are talking about taking over the whole territory of Ukraine, proceeding with the so-called denazification. I think that very few people who met in Russia believe in something like that. It is beyond Russian capacity, and the military operation Russia is currently undertaking clearly is designed to accomplish more limited objectives. No, I'm not talking about granting Russia a victory. You don't grant your adversary a victory when they cannot accomplish it themselves at the battlefield. I'm talking about what kind of a diplomatic arrangement, if any, you want to make to put an end to this situation. I do not know how long this war may last without terrible near-apocalyptic damage to Ukraine. I do not know what it would do to Russian willingness, as I already have mentioned, to start supporting American enemies over the globe. And it's always unpleasant when you think that you have an upper hand to consider something short of total victory. But I think that we know from experience that total victory, unless this total victory doesn't result in an unconditional surrender of your opponent, that this may be very dangerous, because you win a short-term advantage and you may have a huge jubilation in Washington and in Brussels, but you may have a mortal enemy which would be acting against your interests and would come back to you and would act against you whenever they would have an opportunity. That's why I think that unless supporters of unconditional surrender know how to force Russia to accept this surrender at an acceptable cost to the United States, unless they know it, then the only credible alternative is some kind of a negotiated solution.
How receptive, though, is Moscow to a negotiated solution? Isn't another prospect that Putin, from what we read now, Russia is looking at simply annexing some of this Ukrainian territory outright? Why not just create a frozen conflict and keep bombing Ukraine over the next couple of years?
Well, I'm always surprised when people who seem to like Ukraine most would want to continue bombing Ukraine for another couple of years. And the fact that Russia is not doing well of precision guidance weapons, it complicates Russia achieving its military objectives, but it certainly doesn't help Ukraine to avoid catastrophic damage. And the damage may be catastrophic. Ukraine is getting a truly unparalleled assistance from the West on the scale of Marshall Plan and probably beyond. But if Ukraine would be subjected to those kind of attacks for another year, I do not know how much would remain of Ukrainian infrastructure, how many refugees are going to have, how many innocent Ukrainians would have to die. I also think that Ukraine would be hard-pressed under those circumstances to retaliate against Russia. They have more and more heavy weapons. They would learn more and more how to use them effectively. And if the war spreads into Russian territory, which is perfectly possible, if we have this so-called frozen, but not really frozen war scenario, we may come to very close to a possibility of uncontrolled escalation, which I repeat, in my view, may have a truly apocalyptic consequences for both Russia and the United States.
Marvin Kalb, one of the longest observers of Russia and the Soviet Union, has a question. He asks, what would Putin settle for in a negotiation, assuming one is possible, between Putin and Zelensky?
Well, let me start by saying I don't know what Putin would settle for, because Putin never really announced that, because his demands, in my view, were scaled down, but clearly he is not thinking at this point, at least he doesn't appear to be thinking at this point about surrendering any territory which is currently controlled by Russia. And in terms of talking about Russian unconditional surrender, let's be honest with ourselves. The Russians are not doing certainly as well as they hoped for, but they have gained more territory, not less. and they still have a potential of gaining more, moving closer to Odessa and cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea. So I don't think that there is a sense in the Kremlin that their situation is so terrible that they have to accept whatever. That is why, Marvin, I agree with the administration that we are not yet in a situation when we are likely to get a negotiated solution with Russia. I think there is a difference, however, between saying that the situation is not quite ripe for a negotiating solution and saying that we will not accept any solution short of Russian unconditional surrender and Putin's removal from office. I think that we have very few serious discussions with Russia. I interviewed Lavrov on Russian TV, an hour-long interview, and in his almost first sentence, Lavrov said that he regrets that there is almost no dialogue between the United States and Russia, both formal and informal, official and second track. I think that this is not a normal situation when you understand what is at stake. And I think that it is not in our interest to give Putin an impression that we will not cut any deal with him. With the administration, particularly people in the White House, they're saying that regime change is not their objective. They're saying that they can cut a deal with Putin, that even a summit is not a kind of something that is totally rejected out of hand. They obviously are not prepared to accept summit with Putin now when there is absolutely no rationale for this and when this summit would be completely unprepared. But the administration does indicate that in principle, such negotiations and such diplomatic arrangements could be possible. I don't think they quite believe in Moscow that the administration does have this flexibility. And I think that we all would benefit from having some serious discussions with Moscow, even if they cannot bring immediate results, but they would give Putin at least some sense that there may be an acceptable solution.
On this subject, Donald Smith has a question, which is, he asks, given your view that the administration committed some initial diplomatic errors in the run-up to the war, do you think that Biden should call Putin now on the phone and propose a negotiation with him?
No, I don't think so, because we are not at the point when contacts of this nature, particularly formal discussion of this nature, would be justified. But I do think that short of talking about the summit or direct discussions between the two leaders, there are a lot of things we can do publicly and confidentially, which would give both sides first a better understanding of each other's positions, and most important, hopefully would give both capitals a sense that no, there is no yet any light at the end of the tunnel, but at least the tunnel ends. And in principle, if you try, something is possible. We have a situation today when both sides essentially are presenting demands and taking stands which are inconsistent with any negotiated solution. I don't think it's constructive, and I don't see the administration having a real policy of removing Putin from power, and not having a policy of removing Putin from power, but acting as we had such a policy. I don't think that this is a way to get Moscow's concessions.
Paul Starobin wants to know, how likely do you think it is that so-called tactical nuclear weapons would be employed by Russia against Ukraine?
Likely, I think that at this point, very unlikely. because nothing is happening in Ukraine at the battlefield which would justify such a step by Russia. However, once Ukraine gets all these new heavy weapons, once Ukraine masters these weapons, and if as many people assume, myself included, that it would allow Ukraine to change further, if you wish, the balance of forces and the dynamics of war. And if Ukraine will start hitting targets inside Russia, then I think a lot of things which we today consider inconceivable would become possible. Let me also say, Paul, that we are constantly talking about Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That certainly is a possibility. But I have encountered a school of thought in Moscow which was saying that the major problem Russia has in its confrontation with the West is a conviction among European NATO members, including small but very anti-Russian countries like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, a conviction among them that they can say whatever against Russia, can do whatever against Russia, because they are protected by Article 5. And there is a temptation in Moscow to demonstrate that Article 5 for countries like that is not a panacea. And I would not exclude the possibility that if Russia would be suffering damage inside Russia itself, and if the small countries would play a role in arming Ukraine and obviously mobilizing the West further against Russia, supporting more radical anti-Moscow demands, I would not possibly totally exclude the possibility that these countries, rather than Ukraine, may become targets for the use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons.
So in other words, there would be a potential widening of the war beyond Ukraine.
I most certainly see such a potential, but Jacob, here we have to be very careful with our language. I see a potential. I don't see certainty. I don't see likelihood. And if we would be talking about some other weapons with less catastrophic, if you wish, consequences of their use, I would say that this is probably quite unlikely that something like that would happen. But when we're talking about an uncontrolled nuclear escalation, I don't think that we have to be concerned only if something is certain or even likely. Even a possibility is serious enough to be a part of our strategic calculations.
So Bob Einhorn has a good question. And he wonders, the Biden administration has said that the terms of any settlement have to be left to Ukraine and should not be dictated by the US or NATO. But what if American and Ukrainian war aims diverge, with Ukraine, in contrast to the United States, determined to achieve a more ambitious outcome? What then?
Well, first of all, I think that as a diplomatic position, as a public position, it's perfectly appropriate. It certainly would be a mistake, in my view, to create an impression that the United States, the Europeans, that we are going to gang up on Ukraine and to force Ukraine after everything they have suffered and everything they have accomplished, if we would create an impression that at a certain point we would cynically abandon them and accommodate Moscow's terms. I think that the administration is quite right to take a public position they're taking. And when I'm saying public position, I mean that this is a real serious position. I also think that we all understand, and I'm certain President Zelensky understands, that, how to put it, the United States has some influence in Ukraine. That Ukrainian position, of course, depends very heavily on what they expect they can get. in terms of American and other NATO assistance. So if we do feel that a certain solution is appropriate, I think that we have a way, up to a point, of course, but we have a way to have an impact on the Ukrainian thinking. President Zelensky, he speaks very radically. He likes to kind of shame everybody in the West who is not prepared to address Ukrainian needs and accommodate his demands. He is a very good actor. He is also a skillful negotiator. I met Mr. Zelensky in the halls of Channel 1 in Moscow, where he played a role, where he appeared on TV fairly recently. And he was considered a very skillful actor, but also a good negotiator in terms of his needs and requirements. So I do think that President Zelensky, despite his public uncompromising posture, I do think that President Zelensky, if he would be told that he would get major territorial concessions from Russia, that he would end up with more, not less territory than he has now as a result of territorial agreement. And if he would get very important, serious security guarantees, I think that President Zelensky may be inclined to listen. At least I would be prepared to experiment in that area.
We have a question from Lawrence Silverman about something that has not really happened yet in Ukraine, to the surprise of some observers. He asks, do you think Putin is committed to striking at Western military supplies to Ukraine and does not mind a risk of escalation?
It's a very interesting question because a lot of people, myself included, that this would be done. And on Russian TV, I have asked several Russian generals, none of them active duty, but people who were three-star generals who had quite recently senior positions in the military, and one of them was chairman of the Duma Defense Committee, another was former chairman of Duma Defense Committee. And they very confidently have explained that that's exactly what Russia is going to do at the very beginning of the war, that all airports which can receive Western military assistance, that they would be destroyed. The railroads would be severely damaged. Same with the highways. And none of that has really happened. And you have to ask yourself a question, why? Because this is an obvious question. The military logic suggests that the way the Russians have done this war without having superiority in the air, without destroying Ukrainian air defenses, and of course, leaving almost unlimited opportunity for Western supplies to Ukraine, it's very difficult to justify it from the military standpoint. The Russians say, well, they have done that because they were merciful, because Ukrainians are their brothers, because Putin feels very strongly that Russians and Ukrainians are the same people. So they were going out of their way to avoid collateral damage. All I can say is that they clearly have not done what everybody expected, what was logical from their standpoint. And I can offer only one simple explanation. They didn't do it because they did not know quite how to do it, because they did not have adequate intelligence, and because they did not have adequate air superiority. I do not find any other explanation, but I did not hear a persuasive explanation from the Russian side.
You know, this raises the question, since we clearly vastly overrated the capabilities of the Russian military before the war, at least many did, and now it's being called a Potemkin military. Do you think that Putin, he's now 69, has the ability to turn this around in Russia?
Oh, absolutely. But again, Jacob, I want to be sure that I'm addressing what you said. Has the capability. There is no certainty that he can do it. We do not know, we don't have full information about his condition. Fewer and fewer people see him nearby because of COVID restrictions. As a rule, it's either a video conference or like with the case of President Macron, they would be seated far away from each other at a very long table, which also kind of creates certain restrictions on what you can see and what you can observe. On the basis of my conversations in Moscow with people who saw Putin recently, I got two impressions. First, a lot of people say that he has evolved. And it's kind of natural that you would evolve if you were in power for 22 years. When you feel that you know better what is going on than anybody else, that your experience is vastly superior to the experience of any other leader. And you also have to remember a Russian tradition, particularly pre-revolutionary Russian tradition, that a leader, a monarch, he is not considered quite an ordinary man. He is being born as an ordinary man, but in the process of his duties, he grows and changes. It is not an accident that he gets where he is. Clearly, there is a part of some higher will. Clearly, you are being selected by destiny. And as one person who knows Putin and who is considered one of Russian spiritual leaders, he said to me, you know, a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, and he gets where Putin got, and you do what he had done. Isn't it natural to accept that there was higher will behind it, and that at a certain point, a leader like that, he is not just an ordinary man. He is an instrument of destiny and of the Lord. I never heard anything like that from Putin himself, but it certainly is a part, this thinking, this attitude is a part of Russian historical tradition. And I think that Putin is likely to see himself increasingly, if you wish, not just as a historical figure, but as a voice of history. And it makes him a little less interested in the opinions of others who were not chosen and who certainly are less experienced. Let me say, however, one thing. In terms of Russian interagency decision-making, my impression is that there is a lot to be desired, and clearly people, if more people in Moscow, including at the central bank, would be in the loop, it would be more difficult to freeze Russian reserves. They would not be right there when a decision to intervene in Ukraine was made. But I do think that to say that Putin is poorly informed is a mistake. Everybody who deals with me was telling me that he is an enthusiastic consumer of information, and not only intelligence information, that he gets a lot of documents, and that at least in his own mind, he is very well informed.
We have a question from Harley Balzer that takes us in a related but different, slightly different sphere, also touches on the stability of Russia. Harley asks, Alexei Kudrin recently said that it will take Russia's economy a decade to recover GNP to the level of 2021. Was there any discussion of the economic consequences of the war on the part of the people you spoke with in Moscow?
People I spoke with were quite concerned about economic costs of war. And while making clear that they support Putin, that he is their commander-in-chief, and that it's very important for them that he is their commander-in-chief, but they were not part of the decision to intervene in Ukraine, and that basically they're supportive without playing a major role in formulating that decision.
Do you believe, when we're looking at this, the question that keeps coming back to me when we look at the economy, the performance of the military, are we in something like a 1905 scenario where the regime ends up having to give a little on the domestic front? Are we in a 1917 scenario where the entire place goes up in flames and you have a civil war in Russia? Or option C, is it just Russia retreats further towards becoming like North Korea and cracking down internally to crush any dissent?
Jacob, in the West, people and social and political forces in Russia which get most attention are not people and political forces which plays a great role in Russia. There is a category of totally oppositionally minded people who really want to have a Western political model in Russia. They don't always quite understand it, but that's what they want to have, and which totally reject everything Putin represents. It's a relatively small group, and there are hundreds of thousands of people who work in information technology, and they, if you wish, usually sympathetic or frequently sympathetic to that point of view, and quite a few of them are immigrated from Russia today. But Putin has a solid majority inside Russia. It is demonstrated by every public opinion poll, including public opinion polls which clearly are opposition-minded. And there are a lot of people who have questions about Putin's leadership, including in foreign policy. But you may be surprised. Most people from whom I had criticism of Putin's policy is that Putin was too soft, that Putin was indecisive, that he would start a great project and that he would not be prepared to go far enough. They are saying, people of this persuasion, that in 2008, a mistake for Putin was not to invade Georgia, but to allow Saakashvili to attack Russian forces in South Ossetia, and then a kind of counterattack, but not to take over Georgia, which militarily, they say, was quite possible, and that would send a very strong signal to the West of Russian determination. People like that are saying that in 2014, a mistake for Putin was not to take over Crimea, but to make statements about Malorussia, Novorossia being Ukraine, and creating an impression that Russia was willing to take militarily, with the help of local supporters, at least southern part of Ukraine. And then once Russia have encountered opposition, strong opposition on the ground, Russia never persisted, despite a situation when some of Russian supporters were killed, civilian supporters were killed in Odessa. And they're saying that now Russia is not doing enough. And one reason Russia can be treated, in their view, without respect is because Putin would not announce a full mobilization, Putin would not create a mobilizational economy and would not say to the West, we will pay any price for victory. There is no alternative to victory. Putin's position at this point that he wants to avoid humiliating defeat, that he wants to get some results from Russian intervention in Ukraine. But my view is that Putin clearly is not prepared to go all the way into militaristic posture and kind of announce a holy crusade against the West. That is why, in my view, it's important to demonstrate that we are open to negotiated solutions, because it is not in our interest to have a military mobilization in Russia, a full-scale military offensive or counter-offensive from Russia, and giving the Russians a sense that they have to fight like in Great Patriotic War. When the Russians fought against Finland in 1940, they really did not do well. And a lot of people assumed on that basis that Russian army could not fight. And actually, when Hitler invaded, initially the Russian army could not fight, and Russian peasants in the army did not want to fight. It did not take very much time before that unpopular war against Germany somehow evolved into a great patriotic war. And if Russian confrontation with Ukraine would lead to major attacks on Russian territory, if there would be massive Russian casualties, I'm concerned that we may discover a different side of Putin, not just a former intelligence officer, not just a kind of an authoritarian ruler who is trying to have at least some human face. You may see him as a military leader. I would not want unnecessarily to push Russia and Putin personally in that direction.
Well, that is a loud and clear warning. I would just like to pose as a final question, Dmitry. Do you believe that the Biden administration is doing a good job of avoiding that scenario?
I think the Biden administration, the president personally, and some, but not necessarily all of his senior advisors, do understand the danger of uncontrolled escalation in a situation when American fundamental interests and American treaty obligations are not yet involved. And I think that that sense of commendable restraint is not something I see everywhere, to put it delicately, in Congress and in the mainstream media. In a very good book about the origins of World War I, Dominic Levin, Oxford historian, he says that it is an assumption in the West that the civil society, the media, parliaments, that they play a constructive and usually restraining influence in pre-war situations. Well, he says, looking at what was happening before the war, World War I, to put it delicately, it was not quite the case. And I think that the administration, President Biden personally, and to put it delicately, I am not a great supporter of his policies, but I do think that so far, in my view, he demonstrates a sense of responsibility, which is appropriate for a person in his position.
Dmitry, thank you for those fascinating insights into what is taking place in Moscow based on your trip there. And I look forward to a future and hopefully more peaceful discussion about what is taking place in Russia and Ukraine. Thank you again. And with that, we'll end this session.
Jacob, thank you very much.